You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back alongside you.
It's always a pleasure to be back alongside you, Eugene.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, and big shout out to everyone who is tuning in. Very happy to have you here with us. As always, we've got a range of great stories on a range of great topics, so certainly buckle in because it's going to be a good one, as it always is. And I will use this time to remind you, if you are watching on YouTube, it'd be a great opportunity to go ahead and hit subscribe, then hit the bell so you get the alerts to the things that you subscribe to, and then make sure that you have your notifications on. So that way those notifications come through. That way you don't have to do much hard work at all to get all of the great content coming out from Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. So please subscribe, go ahead and hit the bell, and make sure your notifications are on so that you can just make your life not only easier, but better. Rania, are there other things you would like for our viewers to know as we get off the ground here?
Yes, I want to remind everybody that we are an independent media outlet that does not receive funding from corporations, no pharmaceutical money, no weapons contractor money. We are supported by our audience, you. So if you are able to, please consider becoming a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news, and you can become a member for as little as $5 a month. Where you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch like this very cool Breakthrough News mug. Me and Eugene both have one. Super cool. Love it. Thank you very much.
Of course.
But most importantly, you can be help supporting independent media in a crucial time when the amount of propaganda is on hyperdrive. So patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can also donate at our website, breakthroughnews.org, if you want to give a one-time donation. And you can go to, you can actually donate here in the live stream if you're watching, right here on YouTube. But becoming a member, I think, is the best way. And also, other easy ways to support Breakthrough News is you can not just make sure you're subscribed to Breakthrough News and that you tap the bell to make sure that you get notifications when we post new content. You can also smash that like button.
Smash that like button.
Oh, I like that. I like that new noise you got there, John. It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. And with that, we do have a lot of great stories today. We're going to be talking about Black History Month. We're going to be talking about Epstein drama. My God, what a theatrical performance we saw yesterday, but also bigger and more important things surrounding that. We're going to be talking about some unfortunate ICE detention / concentration camp information. And I feel like there's one more story somehow in the mix that I'm forgetting, but we've got a lot to go through.
Yeah, it's an Easter egg. You're gonna have to wade through the rest of the show to find out what that other story may be. So stay tuned, as it were. The way we hold up these mugs, I was watching The Price is Right yesterday. I would love to get some breakthrough swag, and The Price is Right is something that they give out there, but that's a whole separate issue. But I was like, wow, it'd be great to have a breakthrough news mug. How much does it cost? Yeah. Anyway. Listen, game shows. What an American thing.
I used to watch that show. Makes me think of Plinko. Everyone's favorite game was Plinko.
That's true.
I remember Plinko.
Listen, it's a high drama game too. Anyway, long story short, let's get the ball rolling here. Very happy to have you with us as we get the show started. Of course, we are in Black History Month. This is February. It's the 100th anniversary of Black History Month. And at that time, President Trump has been launching a sweeping attack on how U.S. history in general is being taught, especially Black history, claiming that lessons talking about racism in America are quote unquote indoctrination of Americans. And he's also been stripping references to slavery and other aspects of the Black experience from national parks, including in Philadelphia at the National Independence Center, taking something away that talked about George Washington having slaves. So to discuss all this and more, we are very happy to be joined here once again on the show by Dr. Gerald Horne, who's a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston and the author of many books, including the recent The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I want to start here, given that it is the 100th anniversary of Black History Month, so a pretty august anniversary here. Tell us something, if you could, about Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who established Black History Month, and maybe what it means to be celebrating its 100th anniversary.
Well, Carter G. Woodson was born in West Virginia and received a doctorate in history, and immediately, if not sooner, helped to establish the journal that is still being published, then called the Journal of Negro History, now called the Journal of African American History. I should mention parenthetically that he also spent time teaching in the Philippines during the time of the U.S. occupation in the first few decades of the 20th century. The concept of Negro History Week, as it was originally called, was primarily an anti-defamation enterprise. That is to say that, as is well known, particularly by your audience, Black people have been defamed repeatedly because that was used to justify enslavement and then used to justify Jim Crow or U.S. apartheid. So when Carter G. Woodson initiated Negro History Week, now Black History Month, it was an attempt to bring out the other side, the freedom side, if you will. And I think it's fair to say that it has been fairly successful, even during these tempestuous times of Mr. Trump. What I mean by that is that routinely, before 2025 at least, there were Black History Month celebrations at schools, at workplaces, for example. And those are still going on to a degree, despite the offensive led from the White House.
And to speak to that offensive that you reference, I'm curious if you could maybe help us understand this attack on Black History Month from, in the broader context of, maybe American imperial policy and domestic repression. Obviously, there's been a long-standing attack on Black History Month, on the way that slavery is taught, specifically from the right, but it's really gone on, it's been on steroids with this administration. So, yeah, is this rewriting of the past, not just trying to obviously rewrite history, but also is it sort of a prerequisite for justifying the kinds of political crackdowns and foreign interventions we're seeing today?
Well, to a degree, that's true. I think you cannot begin to understand the killing of George Floyd on camera in Minneapolis in 2020 without understanding this continued violence and savagery directed against Black people, which has roots directly within the founding of the so-called republic. That is the nub, because it's difficult to reconcile the soaring rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence and some of the rhetoric of the U.S. Constitution with the bestial manner in which Black people have been maltreated and mistreated. Not only that, but in recent years, there have been a number of attempts to bring this contradiction to a wider audience. I'm thinking of the 1619 Project of Howard University's Nicole Hannah-Jones. I'm thinking of the documentary by the Haitian filmmaker Raoul Peck, Exterminate All the Brutes, a searing excavation of settler colonialism, a term that is not often used, sadly enough, even by our friends on the left, to describe what's befallen this continent. I'm thinking of the late Berkeley historian Tyler Stovall, his book, White Freedom, for example. And so there has been a counteroffensive against the Republican propaganda, and they have now responded by seeking to remove exemplars of slavery, for example, from George Washington's residence in Philadelphia, beginning in 1790.
I mean, it really is amazing on many, as if people didn't know George Washington owned slaves. But, it seems so notable to me in many ways. And I want to note the point we made at the intro in your recent book, The Capital of Slavery, because, what you're saying seems so written in the history of the country and the contemporary reality. Yesterday, the Senate voted to essentially make it impossible for D.C. to vote for its own budget, and the long history of disenfranchisement in Washington, D.C. But the nation's capital having such a seminal role in the early part of the country as a center of the slave trade, I feel like speaks so much to what you're saying, Dr. Horne.
Well, not only that, but it's been captured by Hollywood. You're probably familiar with the film 12 Years a Slave,
Mm.
based on the true story of a free black man, Solomon Northup, inveigled to come to Washington, D.C., where he was enslaved. Washington, D.C. was a major center for the African slave trade. Not only Washington, D.C., but across the river in Alexandria, Virginia, a major center for the African slave trade. Virginia, just across the water from Washington, was also a major center for the breeding of Africans. That is to say, Africans being treated like bulls, where we were bred fundamentally to be shipped to not only slave markets in New Orleans, but ultimately some were shipped to slave markets in Cuba and Brazil, for example. And so Washington, D.C., despite once again the soaring rhetoric, was the capital of slavery. It's not no accident that a disproportionate number of the U.S. presidents before the U.S. Civil War were slave owners. A disproportionate number of U.S. Supreme Court justices were slave owners. It's no accident that the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, in its third stanza, denounces black people because we did not necessarily stand with the Republic during the invasion of the Redcoats, the British, during the War of 1812. And Mr. Trump and his acolytes would like to erase and eradicate this difficult history and instead put forward a history that they consider to be, pardon the expression, hunky dory.
Hmm.
I want to ask, because we talk a lot about fascism today, right? And it's an important conversation because we do see this kind of rising, fascist attitude and this crisis of capitalism that we're seeing in all these Western countries. There's fascist elements to people in the Trump administration, people like Stephen Miller, for example. Of course, the way the U.S. behaves abroad. A lot of comparisons to like Nazi Germany in the 1930s. But, when we talk about the founding of the United States, I just can't think of anything more fascist than the institution of slavery. And it's so incredible to me that we're spoon-fed this narrative about, the only democracy with its flaws, the U.S. being, the oldest democracy with some little flaws like slavery and a little Native American genocide here and there. But other than that, it was really great and lovely ideas. But I guess, what I'm trying to ask you here is, when we actually look at exactly what you're talking about, some of those really disgusting ways or systems, parts of the slavery system that you mentioned in the foundation of the United States, was the United States not a fascist country at its founding? Like literally, what is more fascist than enforced labor through racial hierarchy?
Well, I will say that it's no secret that those who have been given discredit for founding fascism, speaking of Mussolini, Hitler et al., they studied closely and carefully the example of U.S. Jim Crow and U.S. apartheid, for example. I do not dismiss this idea of folks today clamoring about fascism because they have been propagandized not to see their own country, as you just put it, as a seedbed for the rise of fascism in the 20th century. But you are correct to suggest that many of the earmarks that we've come to associate with 20th century fascism were reflected in North America during the bad old days of slavery. Forced labor, unpaid sectors of the working class, sexual mutilation, sexual savagery, for example, the bestial preoccupations of the overlords of slavery, for example. So obviously you're onto something.
I think part of the notable factor to me when we think about Black History Month, and I think the point you're making about how, it has extended into so many institutions, the initial conception of it as a way to bring out the real history of what's happened in this country is almost, history as a weapon, history as a form of struggle, the importance of these different things, and how the fact that these facts are still contested mean that like sort of the role of history is not just to tell nice stories, but to actually have the ability to sort of frame, where we've gone so that we can move forward to something better.
Well, not only that, but some of the most illustrative examples of class struggle can be found in Black History Month, can be found in the numerous and multiple stories of the battles of the unpaid sector of the working class, not only going on strike not only trying to overthrow the regime, but malingering, for example, not necessarily being quiescent when it comes to their own exploitation. And so I think that for the U.S. working class as a whole, Black History Month is of essential importance because it provides a model of how to struggle under often adverse and difficult conditions. And therefore, it's not only a model for the U.S. working class, it's a global model indeed.
Yeah, and I guess the counter to that, well, that explains why they're so desperate to rewrite history, because it does. I guess in this sense, actual history could pose a threat to the ruling class, right? If people were to learn from those examples. But I guess, I'm curious what in particular, when it comes to these sort of regressive people who are in power right now, who want to take us back, in time a little bit to to before people had civil rights, and they're kind of eroding them. What is it they're so terrified of with just the idea of learning about slavery existing in America? Because that it seems like they feel very much under threat by the idea of any memory of that.
Well, as you well know, there are those who would like to present the founding of the United States and the subsequent existence as an exemplar of a shining city on a hill, to use the oft-cited phrase by former and late US President Ronald Wilson Reagan. Obviously, the examples I've been citing with regard to cruel exploitation, working without a wage, it contradicts this idea of a soaring city on the hill, and therefore it helps to undermine the right wing, which now is in power and ultimately recognizes that its grip on power is unsteady, hence this hysterical reaction to any example of Black History Month, any example of bringing forward stories of resistance by the enslaved themselves.
Well, it's going to certainly be interesting here to see how this all develops in the context of the 250th anniversary of the United States, where this sort of reactionary counter history is big. As always, Dr. Gerald Horne, we really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for inviting me.
Rania?
He's the best. I could listen to him go on all day. And, it's so interesting, Eugene, the way that even those who do understand slavery was a thing, it's like I still get shocked, even though I've read about slavery quite a bit, right? I still get shocked when I go back and just hear these stories of just how disgusting this system was. And this is the system that was foundational to this place we're all supposed to celebrate as the oldest democracy ever. It's just almost comically absurd. But wow, it's just when you start talking about the way that you're breeding people like they're cattle to make them work, and then sexually mutilating them, and cutting off limbs as punishment if they try to run away. But America was some sort of democracy. I mean, give me a break.
Yeah, it's amazing. And that's why they got to take the stuff off the national historical sites, I guess, because there's no way to actually make it look legitimate in this day and age at this point. And yeah, it's crazy. I can only imagine how much worse it's going to get too in the context of everything they're planning in terms of the U.S. history 250 and Jesus Christ. And Trump is doing something on July 4th in Philadelphia, which and of course, the thing that's come out, Rania, too, is that how they're raising money to meet with Trump. And so it's $5 million if you're something like that, or I don't know exactly what it was, but the New York Times was reporting it. If you contribute to the celebration in July in Philadelphia, you can meet with Trump. So it's all these rich people and corporations lining up to give money for this whitewash of history so they can come promote whatever corrupt deal they have going on.
Get some access to the man in charge.
I sure do. Well, the man in charge is engineering a catastrophic crisis in Cuba right now. Donald Trump has launched a full-scale economic war. I don't even know, maybe supercharged economic war. It was already pretty significant against the island country and its people. Total embargo of the island, cutting off access to oil and fuel, and that means electricity and basically modern society. And he's been threatening very severe penalties on any other country that tries to help help Cuba delivering energy or other forms of trade to alleviate the humanitarian crisis. So to talk about all this and more, we're very happy to be joined here once again on the show by the Mexican journalist José Luis Granados, who is the co-author of the Drop Site News investigation. Marco Rubio is deliberately blocking Trump from Cuba talks. José Luis, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be able to talk about this really important story that we just broke a couple days ago.
Absolutely. I think it's critically important, and I want to start there because as you lay out, and I don't want to presuppose it too much, there was the whole meme coming out from Trump like, oh, we're negotiating with them. We're talking about Cuba. We're talking to them, blah, 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 blah. And then that turned out to not necessarily be the case, it seems.
That's just it. That it turns out that Rubio, State Department, is not being really forthcoming about what's actually going on when it comes to talks. So, of course, I want to credit, the co-authors of this piece, Noah Colwyn and Ryan Grimm, who did a lot of the legwork here in terms of getting this scoop. But they talked to high-level officials in the U.S., also in Cuba. Cuban officials actually have confirmed our reporting. There are no dialogues happening in sort of a formal sense between the U.S. and Cuba right now, but Donald Trump seems to believe that there is. And that has been his messaging. So it seems that somebody here is not telling the whole truth. And that part's worrisome because, as we've seen, Trump is somebody who's not always strictly driven by ideological questions, right? He's very much a deal maker. And Cuba is ready to make a deal. They want to figure out a solution to this. Obviously, they understand the implications of this latest escalation, this augmentation of the blockade against them, and they want to figure out if a deal is possible. But for that, you have to actually have dialogue. And I think there's one really important point that we have to emphasize here, which is coming directly from the Cubans. They have said that any negotiations when it comes to the U.S.-Cuba relationship are held at the highest level. So we're talking about the leadership of the country up to and including President Miguel Díaz-Canel. So when the Cubans say there's no dialogue happening, that means that the key players are not in the room together. Obviously, there's a lot of kind of cooperation that happens at a lower level, like the United States pretty much does with any country, even ones that considers its adversaries, around, for example, migration. There was recently a deportation flight of Cubans to Cuba. So there are dialogues happening, but in terms of an actual high-level discussion to find a solution to this, to reach a deal, that is not happening. But as far as our reporting tells us, it believes that Rubio is not really telling him the truth, and I think we have to say why. I think Rubio thinks that if he can convince Trump that talks are happening, but they're not fruitful, that he can push him to take even more radical action. This is the Florida Gusano lobby that is really pushing for essentially the collapse of the Cuban government. And who knows what kind of consequences that would bring for the Cuban population, which, again, to emphasize, is already suffering under this. We're already seeing some other representatives from Florida calling for even harsher measures. So we know that they want to go for more. And I think exposing this is really critical to actually getting this information to the key people, including Trump, that a deal can be made. Does he want to continue to go out there and say, I'm a man of peace and I am somebody who resolves conflicts? Well, the possibility here, it could be historic for U.S.-Cuba relations, but they got to get together at the table. And for that, well, he needs to have the right information.
I mean, it's just completely barbaric what we're witnessing right now. But I want to emphasize why, in the sense that, Cuba's been dealing with this U.S. blockade for 60 plus years, right? So everyone's used to hearing that Cuba's being kind of suffocated or strangled in some way by the U.S. This way, that way, denied access to, medicines and all kinds of supplies. Why is this, which is basically the Trump administration threatening tariffs on any country in the world that sends oil to Cuba? Why is this so much more dangerous than what the U.S. has already been doing to Cuba?
Well, as Eugene said at the intro here, basically having access to energy resources is how you're able to participate in a modern society. And that's true of Cuba as it is of the United States, Mexico, wherever you are. Cuba has a dated energy infrastructure, as a consequence of the blockade. It's very difficult for them to be able to secure new materials or new parts and kind of do the upkeep. And it's one that is very much kind of in the mold of energy provision generation of the 20th century, which is largely, hydrocarbons. They very much depended on the imports of oil from the Soviet Union for a long time. Then it was Venezuela. And for a while there, it was also Mexico, after Venezuela was, obviously subject to its own, they call it a quarantine, but the more accurate term is blockade. I think that's also important to mention as well, that this didn't start to become an issue for Cuba in January after the kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro, but actually there hasn't been shipments from Venezuela of oil to Cuba since perhaps early December or late November. So we're talking about quite a long bit of time now that they haven't had access to this. And what does it mean? It means blackouts. It means hospitals can't run. It means ICUs won't be able to attend to the patients. It means there's no gas for the state-backed taxi drivers to take people to their dialysis payments. It means fruits and vegetables from the countryside can't make it to the cities because there's no diesel for the trucks. I mean, it is devastating. And these effects are already being held. We published a second piece in conjunction with Belly of the Beast, excellent on-the-ground reporting there from them, which talked to ordinary Cubans, and they'll tell you themselves that things are worse than ever. The blockade has been accumulating, year after year. It gets harder and harder. Then they're cutting off their allies. On the question of Mexico, I think it's also important to mention, as I said, Mexico had started providing, become the main supplier of oil to Cuba. But now, in the face of this threat, the Mexican government has suspended its shipments of oil. It is sending humanitarian aid. The boat actually arrived today. They sent 2 Navy ships. I think the fact that the Navy had to be involved in the delivery of this humanitarian aid is important to mention, that Mexico felt like this had to be delivered this way, has now arrived, and there'll be another shipment. So, they are continuing to try to do what is possible right now, given these diplomatic constraints. But ultimately, what we're seeing is, again, another manifestation of the extraterritorial application of US policies to other countries. I mean, for me, I find it really frustrating that Mexico, an independent sovereign country, seems to have his hands tied when it comes to selling oil to Cuba, another sovereign independent country. I mean, it's absurd on the face of it, but why is this happening? Well, I think Mexico is under tremendous diplomatic pressure. I think a message must have been sent through the various channels that they exist between the US and Mexico, that if they do send oil, that Trump will apply these tariffs. And that has the government spooked, essentially, into not wanting to try to block the blockade, to break that blockade. So that's why I think also the demand here on the streets of Mexico is for the Mexican government to find a way to break the blockade. And that should be true of Mexico, of Colombia, of Brazil, all the other countries. I think we really have to reckon with the fact that clearly something in the region is missing, something that can allow states to be able to actually find the conviction, the courage to really take on US imperialism here. Because I suspect that part of the motivation behind the Mexican government not being willing to take this on is because we've seen time and time again here in this region that countries seemingly stand alone. Where is the regional unity? Where is the bloc? Where is an institution that can actually champion the need for countries to work in concert with each other to be able to face off with US imperialism? It hasn't been there. And I'm not just talking about the relatively low amount of outrage around the kidnapping of a sitting president that happened, just a month ago, or the extrajudicial execution campaign throughout the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. So I think there's a lot of regional leaders who are asking themselves, if I do something, if I go out on a limb here, I'm all alone. And that really, I think, is the really serious question that we have to address as a region, that its leadership and the peoples of this region really, in this moment, have to reckon. And who's paying the price? The Cubans. The Cubans who have been in solidarity with the peoples of Latin America and the world since the Cuban Revolution. Cubans gave their lives defending Maduro. Why haven't we been able to return that generosity, that solidarity to the Cubans in this moment when they need it most?
Mm-hmm. No, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think it comes down to the use of military force to some degree. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of the 32 Cubans, because ultimately, Cuba has been willing to stand up and be counted in the critical moments. And I feel I mean, to me, you look at the Maduro situation, you look at the threats of the attacks on Mexico, that what really seems to be lacking to me is, the Brazils of the world, the Colombias of the world, the Mexicos of the world know that they're going to have to take military casualties if they're going to stand up to the United States, I think. I mean, it seems like that's the sort of line in the sand the U.S. is drawing, which is obviously a fraught issue, and that's easy for me to say, but it does feel like that's kind of where we are in the world, where the U.S. is saying might makes right. And if you're not willing to say, okay, let's square up, there's no other choice but then to take a step back.
And it would be easier to be able to wrestle with these realities if there was regional unity, if there was a space to kind of discuss it, to agree that an aggressive military action against one would be, call for a defensive collective response. But it's not there. It's not there. And that doesn't mean that all hope is lost, that there won't be a solution. I mean, this comes up in President Claudia Sheinbaum's morning press conference almost every day at this point now, really, where she's insisting that they are in high-level communications with the United States to figure out a solution to this. I hope that will be fruitful, but also I think, we always have to consider the role of popular movements. Just today, a flotilla to Cuba was announced. So a coalition of groups organized through various different channels are now preparing to set off from various parts of the world, I think including Mexico, to Cuba to deliver aid directly. And I think that's a quite interesting proposal in the sense that it creates buy-in for us, right? For these movements to understand that we can't just beg our governments to do the work of trying to convince the gringos to allow us to ship oil. We have to get involved, and we have to be conscious of why this is important. I think one of the things that's been really interesting that's been happening here in Mexico is that Morena, the governing party here, has been holding assemblies throughout the country, talking about sovereignty, talking about imperialism, using this moment to engage in political education so that there's a higher level of consciousness and there's greater mobilization. That mobilization really matters in a country that is governed by a progressive force because it allows them a little bit more room to operate, right? To feel like they have the backing of the population to be able to take those kinds of risky positions, to feel that I know that the people of my country are behind me. So when I'm in that room negotiating with whoever it is, that I have that position of strength. And so that's why these mobilizations, this flotilla, it's going to be important for that people to directly engage in people-to-people solidarity with Cuba so that they understand the importance of it. And hopefully we can start to shift the actual conditions, the balance of forces that exists in this region to favor the interests of popular forces and of a revolutionary government in Cuba, which again, I insist, has always been in solidarity with us, and therefore we cannot abandon in this moment. Mm-hmm.
That word sovereignty is so important. And I really think I just want to zoom out here for a moment, because when I look at what's happening in Cuba now and the way that the U.S. is, using this gunboat diplomacy to kind of force everybody to stand down or try to force everybody to stand down. This is an attack not just on Cuba's sovereignty, but really it becomes an attack on anyone's sovereignty because it doesn't stop with Cuba, right? And I look at what's happening in Cuba. You're talking about a flotilla. That's fantastic. There's a flotilla organized by people's movements that want to break the blockade on Cuba. We're also having to do this with Gaza. And, obviously Gaza is a different situation, but there are some similar elements in the sense that regionally, the entire region has capitulated or either stood down at the barrel of a U.S. or Israeli gun. Same thing. But, has stood down because of the threat of violence or actually losing to that violence. And all that you have left is people trying to break a blockade. And you had 2 years of Gaza and the ongoing attacks on the sovereignty of neighboring countries as well by the U.S. and the Israelis, and nothing being done about it. And now it's happening in Latin America, the kidnapping of a sitting head of state, they've essentially complete blockading and starvation of an entire island nation of Cuba. And I just wonder, do these leaders, I'm sure Claudia Sheinbaum does, but do these governments recognize that it doesn't stop at Cuba? If this is allowed to happen, if it's allowed to pass, someone else is next.
I've made exactly the same argument in a recent column that I wrote for Mexico Solidarity Media, where, Mexico is worried, right? She says, we don't want to harm Mexico. And the trouble is that a concession to U.S. imperialism in the short term ultimately will damage Mexico over the long term. And I wanted to pick up what you said about Gaza because I don't think that's an inappropriate comparison. In fact, I interviewed a woman named Olivia Garza. She's the head of, involved with the Cuban Residents in Mexico Association, José Martí. And she said the same exact thing, and I'll quote her directly. She says, if there is an oil blockade, which essentially is about to come into fruition now, they're about to run out of oil in Cuba. She says, quote, the human cost would be incalculable. It would be a Gaza in the Caribbean, where nothing gets in, and all because of a desire to starve and subdue the Cuban people. It's the same logic. You know, it is a rebellious people. You know, we call Cuba here in Latin America the first free territory of the hemisphere. It's free because it broke free of the chains of U.S. imperialism through its revolution. And so that's really the problem. You know, it's Marco Rubio on his lifelong quest to try to achieve regime change there. And their methods are starvation, subduing, because they're a rebellious people, because there is a resistance there. You know, in the case of Gaza, it's an organized armed resistance movement. In the case of Cuba, it's a revolutionary government led by the Communist Party, right? These are rebellious forces, and the United States wants to send them a lesson, to teach them a lesson by starving and subduing them. That is the worst kind of diplomacy, if you want to call it that. It is brutal. It is violence. It is unacceptable. And yet we find ourselves in a situation where a total crisis like this is right around the corner.
Well, Jose Luis, we really appreciate all your reporting. And I should have mentioned at the outset, you're also the co-host of the Soberanía Mexican Politics podcast with our friend Kurt Hackbarth, which is great and also essential on many of these key questions. Thanks, as always, for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much.
Rania?
I mean, that was fantastic. I think that everything he said is absolutely correct. And it's really, if these countries don't, I like the way he put it. It's a capitulation to U.S. imperialism in the short term will screw you in the long term, because ultimately this doesn't stop with Cuba.
Well, we're going to move on with another critically important story, and that is I don't even really know what to call this. I mean, the United States already maintains the world's largest immigration detention system. Now the Trump administration is moving forward with what, I don't know, one of the largest expansions that's ever happened. They're buying huge warehouses all around the country and converting them into jails. So to discuss more about everything that is happening here in regards to the expansion process and also the reality of what's going on inside of these detention centers, we are very, very honored to be joined by Setareh Ghandehari, who is the advocacy director at the Detention Watch Network. Setareh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you here. I mean, maybe you could just give us some context for this expansion. I mean, I know there's been a lot of reporting about it. I mean, it's hard to wrap your mind around both the geographical expansion and also the size of these warehouses, and then what that even means to be putting people in warehouses. So maybe you could just give us an overall context of what ICE is going for here.
Sure. I mean, what we're seeing now is, as you said in your intro, an unprecedented expansion, but it's being built upon, 2 decades of the expansion of the ICE detention system. But we've seen kind of every year Congress give ICE more and more money to expand its system. But to your point, where, at the beginning of the current administration, so about this time last year, there were somewhere around 39,000 people in ICE detention. And today there are over 70,000 people. And the administration and ICE has made very clear that their intention is to be able to detain more than 100,000 people at any given time. So this expansion into warehouses is one way for them to easily hit that number. What we're looking at and what they're considering for these warehouses is to be able to detain in each one of them anywhere between, 1,500 to 8,000 people in one facility that's not even designed to detain human beings. These are industrial warehouses in various parts of the country. So we already know that the conditions inside of ICE detention centers that are historically, in local jails and in prisons, in private prisons, federal prisons, those conditions are already awful. And now we're looking at expanding into these warehouse structures that aren't even designed for, detaining humans.
I want you to, if you can, elaborate on that, because you talk about, we already know, the U.S. maintains the world's largest immigration detention system, and you mentioned these conditions that are inside of these facilities are already abysmal, and that's, of course, in terms of things like medical care, due process, isolation, abuse. I mean, recently I've been seeing videos of there's children in these facilities as well. So I'm curious if you can talk about a bit about the conditions inside of the facilities that already exist today, and then, of course, what happens when you scale that system up even further?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know what happens, we have decades at this point of documentation about how awful conditions are. People have often reported on the lack of access to adequate food. People are often given moldy food, insufficient food. There's issues with access to clean water, plumbing problems, lack of access to soap, and just the basics that you need to survive. And this is, again, documented for decades. And then what we saw last year with the massive ramp up in targeting and arresting and detaining and deporting of people is that these conditions were exacerbated and got that much worse. We heard people last year talking about, starvation, sleeping on floors because the facilities were so crowded, not being given blankets. Again, because of the rapid expansion and the way they have just been, rushing through construction of some of these, tent cities, for example. There have been plumbing problems, or one toilet for, dozens of people. So this is what happens when you expand rapidly at such a scale, when you're already talking about facilities where, ICE and the private prison companies and, all the people involved don't care about the health and well-being of the people in their custody. And then you add on this sort of chaotic and aggressive enforcement and this rapid expansion. And of course, you're going to get this deterioration in the conditions. And, last year was the deadliest year in ICE custody that we've seen in 20 years. 31 people died in ICE custody. Already this year, 6 people have died in ICE custody, which, at that rate, we're looking to exceed the record that was set last year. So the conditions are, and then when you think about the fact that these warehouses, they're looking to rapidly scale them, they're not designed for detention. So whatever they do is probably going to be shoddy. We may see cages used in these. I mean, we don't know what it's going to look like inside, but we know that they're moving fast. So whatever happens, the conditions are going to be, I think, unconscionable.
No, I think that's very much the case. I mean, I live in Baltimore, and I mean, we saw what happened there, and then just in an office building. And you could argue an office building is not as bad as a warehouse. So if that's where it's that like that there, you can see what it is. And I was hoping one thing you could say a little bit about too is the mental health aspect of this, and especially I think on younger people. I mean, I know ProPublica released their investigation yesterday with some interviews with some parents that were pretty harrowing about the impact on not just themselves but on their kids of being locked up. And of course, this is true about all prisons, but I think it's an important aspect about this that we don't think enough about or talk enough about in terms of what it means to be locking people down, often in sort of for indefinite periods of time.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the issue of children, we know, and medical professionals have repeated again and again that any amount of detention for a child is going to cause long-term harm and long-term trauma. And, what we're seeing with families being snatched up off the street, children being forced to, being detained in these sort of short-term facilities and then being transferred to this massive detention center in Texas that's intended for families, Dilley, that there is, long-term trauma that's going to happen, that's going to impact people, children's lives and adults' lives for years to come. We have worked closely with people who have been detained, and they talk about the long-term trauma that results in, and the long-term mental health trauma, and also even physical trauma. What they suffer inside of ICE detention has long-term health effects for folks. The lack of proper nutritional care, the lack of regular medical care, all of that has long-term impacts. We know that inside of ICE detention centers, ICE has, especially in the last couple of years, been using solitary confinement to an extreme degree, and at the amounts that they're using it, it amounts to the definition of torture. And of course, we know that solitary confinement can have a real impact on people's lives. And I think, last year there were a couple of the deaths that occurred were, the result of suicide. So it really has awful impact on people's both mental and physical health.
I do want to ask you about who stands to, profit from building and operating these mega centers. But, I want to kind of elaborate on that question a bit. And I don't mean to sound a little crazy here, but when we look at ICE and we see the way that this administration has used it to not just, supposedly enforce immigration policy, but also to suppress protests and popular movements, even leading to the street executions of American citizens that we saw happen in Minnesota. And then we see what they're doing with these detention centers and this massive expansion, right? If these mass jails become a new normal, I guess you're kind of looking at an entrenchment of a permanent mass detention regime, right? And that's not to say it's okay to do it against immigrants. I'm not saying it's okay in that respect. But isn't there also a danger here, like we've seen with ICE, of this then being used in a broader politicized, scary context, even more so than it's being said to be used for?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have a lot of history to rely on to your point. Once you have this sort of carceral infrastructure, once it's built up, once it's expanded, there are incentives to keep those facilities full. I mean, we've seen that in the immigration context where, sort of the cycling of prisons between, immigration being used for immigration detention and then cycling and being used for, criminal custody and sort of going back and forth constantly. There's that constant cycle of recycling prisons. So I think it's not a wild idea to say that once this infrastructure is in place, they're going to want to keep it profitable. And absolutely, I think part of all of this has been not just about attacking immigrants, but about suppression of dissent, attacks on democracy. We have said from, day one of this administration that what we're seeing in immigration enforcement is really a testing ground for how far this authoritarian administration is willing to go and how far people are willing to accept it to go. If we allow our immigrant friends, families, neighbors to be attacked and detained like this, that kind of gives them that inch to keep going. And we've already seen the way that they've attacked, people who have supported Palestinian liberation, going after, students protesting the genocide in Gaza, folks standing up for their immigrant friends and neighbors. So we're already seeing that. So I think that risk is really real. And it's part of why we're so clear about our advocacy around making sure that we actually prevent ICE from being able to build up this infrastructure. We have to stop them before they're able to create these warehouse detention centers, because once they're there, they're going to fill them and there may be a new target tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Well, and on that note, I think it's worth noting, Detention Watch, you've been on the front lines of this issue for some time. If people are watching this and want to know more about the Detention Watch Network, where they can find you, how they can support you, where should they go?
Absolutely. We have our website, detentionwatchnetwork.org, and you can find us on social media at Detention Watched.
Mm-hmm. Well, Setareh, we really appreciate you joining us here on the show. Appreciate all your work. Thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, I mean, when they put us all in these detention centers, I'm sure the Democrats will save us.
I hope so. That's all. I'm only laughing because you got to laugh to keep from crying, and it really is wild. And I think your point is very well taken. I mean, one thing that I feel has maybe been underreported is because there are so many immigrant workers now, a bunch of labor organizers have been caught up in this. And it's like under the guise of them having different immigration things. But you always think they obviously are targeting people for a reason. They have a list of people. So something tells me that it's probably like not that random if they snatch someone up in, eastern in Washington state that had been organizing immigrant workers and different things. But, you know, the impacts of this are so wide ranging. And yes, I think the point you're making is so well taken. I mean, of course, we remember Japanese internment in World War II. And I think that's a precedent that we have to keep in front of us here, because what else can you really say when they're buying, it seems like, dozens and dozens of massive warehouses to put people in prison?
I mean, I'm talking about, like, they won't shut up about the left, the radical left, and Antifa, and on and on and on, and George Soros, and RICO charges against Code Pink. And I'm just like, they literally are using ICE right now to shoot people in the streets. What is to stop them from using their mass detention centers to just put in their, like, actual political opponents, like protesters, who they're so scared of because they have matching signs, and matching signs is a conspiracy funded by, you know, name your favorite enemy state.
Yeah,
which is literally what we're hearing from these people.
It's a good point. I mean, if you think about ICE even as a concept, of course, ICE used to be the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, and it became ICE post 9/11 with the creation of DHS, which, you know, it's funny how, like, people forget that things are relatively new. Like, the DHS is a post 9/11 creation, but the whole thing, Department of Homeland Security, turning ICE. I mean, ICE always had like a quote unquote, you know, INS also had sort of a national security thing, but it was more of a law enforcement thing. But then they started making it a part of national security, and you lump them all together. You got the Coast Guard, you got ICE, you got Border Patrol, you got TSA, you've got Homeland Security, you've got national security. So it's like when they're also talking about political threats as national security threats, which they were talking about, by the way, in the House Ways and Means Committee just a couple days ago, like, it is actually under the same umbrella, essentially, in terms of what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like, at this point, I just feel like there's no opposition in positions of power to any of this that really matters. Though, like, we should note, like, Tom Homan did call off the surge in Minnesota, but I don't think that was because of the Democrats. That was because people wouldn't stop getting in the streets. You had a general strike, like, take place in Minneapolis, which is a really big deal. You've had students walking out. Like, I think that actual people getting together and being a part of a movement had more to do with that than anything the opposition party was doing.
No, I think you're 100% right. I mean, we want to move to our next guest, but I remember right before the January 30th no work, no school, no shopping day, I saw this professor at the Stern Business School at NYU, so not some crazy radical, but he's obviously against this mass deportation campaign. And he was making that point. He said, you know, workers in the United States and consumers, you could turn the GDP negative in one day, you know, and we live in an almighty dollar society. So I think you're 100% right about what it caused them to start backpedaling in a lot of different fronts. Well, let's move on to another front here, and that is the ongoing firestorm, as it were, around the Epstein files. The Attorney General, Pamela Bondi, was in front of the Judiciary Committee yesterday for an oversight hearing. There are a lot of clashes between her and Democrats over how her office and the broader Trump administration has handled the Jeffrey Epstein case files. In particular, the fact that a number of prominent U.S. figures seem to, at least at this point, have avoided, if not certainly consequences, but even seemingly serious scrutiny. Although in Europe, it does seem that the number of figures are sort of falling here and the dominoes are going down. So to discuss this more in depth, we are very happy to be joined by Ryan Grimm, who's a co-founder of Dropsite News. Ryan, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you here. And I guess I wonder what you make of the hearing yesterday. I mean, is Pam Bondi this binder that she had with sort of rejoinders against Congress people, and it's a sort of circus-like atmosphere? But it does seem sort of, when you take a couple steps back, that there was a lot of key reveals that, despite the claim that they're the most transparent administration of all time, that the Trump administration has not really dealt with this in a judicious manner.
Don't you understand that the Dow is at $50,000? Like, what are you even? Like, what do we even do? What are you even trying to do here?
What are we talking about?
Yeah. I mean, the NASDAQ is at whatever the NASDAQ's at. I mean, come on. What's wrong with you guys?
Yeah. I've got my portfolio's in the wrong stocks, so I just, I
guess if you're not personally benefiting, then you're not going to talk about the most important thing, which is the Dow. She had that whole book that. And apparently they had been tracking, what files different members of Congress had asked to view. And then she was ready to somehow that's some kind of gotcha. Or she's like, you suck because of this other thing. And I think it really is that Trump feels like Trump is the most out of touch person in the country after maybe Michael Tracy on this question. Actually, maybe they're equally, like they're making the same arguments basically. And I think that maybe they both believe it. So Trump is in this like delusional state that if he just keeps repeating that there's nothing to see here, this is a giant hoax, it's all Democrats, that's going to work. And people are just at a place with Trump where he's an old man and he just talks and like, okay, whatever. Like you don't even fight him anymore. It's like, whatever. Democratic hoax, Epstein. But then he tells his aides to use this same technique when they go down to Capitol Hill, and it just doesn't work for somebody like Bondi, who, like, whatever you want to say about her, she still has her marbles. Like, she's still a, fully conscious, like, adult human being. So to hear her try to impersonate, like, somebody who's, like, sundowning just comes off as this utterly weird performance. Because she's only performing for one person, Trump. Like, and she has to know that what she's doing makes her look to everyone else in the country except Trump and Michael Tracy utterly ridiculous. But she's
so insane.
If she doesn't do it, she's fired. No, that's it. It's like she has to. She's like, it's either that or resign.
Well, I know everyone's seen like 1,000 clips, but we do have one we wanted to play that alludes to what you were trying to reenact there. And I would like for people who haven't seen it to see it. So can we play that Pam Bondi clip just for the vibes?
Never too many times. Yeah.
We now have concrete evidence of disgusting criminality revealed in the Epstein files. So I really have just one question for you. How many of Epstein's co-conspirators have you indicted? How many perpetrators are you even investigating?
First, you showed it. I find it.
How many have you indicted?
Excuse me. I'm going to answer the question.
Answer my question.
No, I'm going to answer the question the way I want to answer the question.
No,
Your
you're going to answer the
theatrics are
question
ridiculous.
the way I asked it.
Chairman Jordan, I'm not going to get in the gutter with these people, but I'm going to answer the question.
How many have you indicted?
Again, the time belongs
Reclaiming
to
my time.
You can let her filibuster all day long, but not on our watch. Not on our time. No way. And I told you about that, Attorney General, before you started.
You don't tell me.
Yeah, I did tell you because we saw what you did in the Senate.
Lawyer, not even a lawyer.
Committee will be in order.
You sit here and you attack the president, and I am not going to have it. I'm not going to put up with it. The Dow right now is over. The Dow is over $50,000. I don't know why you're laughing. You're a great stock trader, as I hear, Raskin. The Dow is over 50,000 right now. The S&P at almost 7,000. And the NASDAQ smashing records. Americans' 401ks and retirement savings are booming. That's what we should be talking about.
At the
She's
Judiciary
like trying
Committee.
to hold in her laughter. She's literally trying to hold in her own laughter because she knows how ridiculous that is. But, in all seriousness, Ryan, if it's even possible to be serious after yesterday, like yesterday's theater was so insane. I think it's interesting to watch how this is playing out in other countries, particularly across Europe, where you're seeing prominent figures who were named in these, Epstein emails, basically being taken down. The government in the UK might fall over it. Whereas there's this growing frustration in the US because you have these prominent US figures named in these files that have avoided any meaningful consequences. So I don't know, based on your own reporting, and you've reported a lot on this, and I do want to get into other specifics of that. Do you think this is like a failure of evidence, of political will? Is it institutional protection? Is it all of it? What's going on here? Why does it seem like in the U.S., aside from the theater of it all, nothing's actually happening to the people who were named?
I think they're doing a pretty effective job at sort of just flooding the zone with nonsense, and creating this environment of just total chaos. And in that, in that chaos, it's becomes harder to then, apply accountability to particular figures. So I think the chaos is kind of the point. if you think about Me Too, as that was going like from industry to industry, there was like an order to it. It was like, oh, this week, like Wall Street's getting Me Too'd. And then all these Wall Street figures are getting like named and then fired. Oh, now this next week it's like the tech world, or what Ohio State's getting it this week. And that order, there was power in that order, that the public could marshal toward accountability. This total like lunacy makes it genuinely harder for people to get behind a single thing. And so, yeah, I would assume that's the design behind this. Just make it as chaotic as possible and hope that then there's because the files include all of these like unverified tips that just came in after he was dead from just the public. Like a lot of that is just bogus. Like anybody could write the FBI and say like, hey, Epstein buried bodies in, my grandmother's backyard. And then they redact it in such a way as to paradoxically make it look more valid. Like sometimes what you hide, if you had actually revealed it, you're like, oh, like this person, this crazy person, they have no idea what they're talking about. So then you get people chasing those things rather than focusing on the actually powerful figures who are involved in this. Like UK is, and you can show, like, I think once the US starts really blaming Russia for Epstein, that's when you'll know you're getting closer to over the target, because that's what they're doing in the UK now. Is they're like, okay, yes, he was definitely in the intelligence world, and we figured it out. It's the KGB, and that's how you know that they're over the target in the UK, because the chief of staff, Morgan McSweeney, this longtime creature, resigned a couple days ago because he had advocated for Peter Mandelson to be the UK ambassador to the US, despite the fact that he had these long, standing connections to Epstein. And the new files revealed that he's like leaking sensitive financial information to Epstein so he can trade on it, and seems like getting apparently bribed by him. And, he's in some serious, like, potentially criminal trouble. So McSweeney's going down. Like you said, Keir Starmer himself may end up going down. So they have to start producing some antibodies that point to Russia. Whereas in the US, they haven't really had to do that yet, because they're kind of fending off the fever so far with all of this chaos. And the Dow's at 50,000. So what are we gonna do?
Yeah,
you guys need a stock ticker.
America's 401k is booming.
On the bottom.
The Judiciary Committee needs to start talking more often about how the stock market is booming.
Where's the NASDAQ? Yeah.
I wonder how, there's so many different issues around the midterms. I mean, there's obviously affordability. Trump is failing there. Obviously, it's, immigration, it's sort of backfiring even with some Republicans. I mean, how do you think that this is going to impact on them? Because, of course, there's the Trump, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and no one would even care. But you see some of these hardcore MAGA people, Nancy Mace's of the world and others in Congress, obviously Thomas Massie, other people who are not, necessarily hardcore Trumpers, but certainly, firmly in the right-wing camp, who are really seriously criticizing them on this. And it just makes you wonder if this might be, a key issue that takes the sheen, not just off of sort of Trump, but the broader kind of MAGA appeal in the midterms.
Right. Trump's line about shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue, it's like he almost went ahead and did something worse than that. It's not good to shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, but like covering up for like a child sex trafficking ring. Like if he would have said, I could cover up for a child sex trafficking ring and my supporters would stay with me, people would be like, actually, I'm not so sure about that. Right. Like some people actually might be okay with you shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue, but covering up a child sex ring, like that's, and people have to remember that on the right, this was the entry point for a lot of people into politics, like starting in like the 1990s. You had these moral panics, and some of them real, some of them just kind of fabricated panics about child trafficking, child sex abuse, and it was central to the kind of the right-wing identity beginning 30 years ago pretty much, and then really accelerating with QAnon and with Pizzagate and with Hillary. And so it's embedded in in MAGA's kind of core set of values. I think somebody said about Marjorie Taylor Greene, like, she might actually have been serious. Like, she's against child sex trafficking. She's against it. And that's a core value. And there are a non-trivial faction of MAGA who genuinely believes that and believes that Trump is on the wrong side of that issue. If we get a wipeout like we're looking at in the midterms, then I think you really see, to your question about how Republicans are going to respond, then they're looking at the next election. They know Trump won't be on the ballot and also he won't have the juice to try to do some, let me run for another term. It's like, bro, like, just got wiped out.
Retire.
Right. Even if it were constitutional, like, there would be some reluctance to be like, you really sure? Like, this is getting really bad. So then you may see, significant breaks as Republicans start to, think about their own careers.
You mentioned moral panics of the 1990s. I once rabbit holed there was the satanic abuse panic that the right was actually very obsessed with, and it engulfed entire random towns in the US. It's really, really insane. But this is not a moral panic. This stuff really happened. And there's so many elements to it. You're absolutely right. They're flooding the zone. And there's a few elements you guys have covered at Dropset that I want to ask you about. Two countries in particular. One is obviously the Israel Epstein connection, which the mainstream media has still really been very completely reluctant to touch. I can't imagine why. But it's an interesting connection that continues to get deeper and deeper. So I'm curious if you can kind of give our audience this sort of abridged version of what the Israel Epstein connection is all about. And then maybe a bit on the Emirates, because that's also, I live in Lebanon. I'm in Lebanon now. And that actually, that element of this has really taken everyone by storm. It's all over Instagram. Just the craziest stories about these random Emirati royals and people close to the government and their involvement with Epstein, literally trying to sell him children that they're related to. But anyways, the Israel UAE connections.
He should have kind of taken them up on the offer to basically just camp out there. Like, he might still be a free person. And as you know, although some of the audience may not, the UAE is really, UAE and Israel are very, very tight. These are two gangsters in the same mafia in the region. And the UAE is not really a country. It's it has the structures, and not being biased, say the same thing about Qatar, and to some degree Israel has the structures of a state, but it's really a couple families that operate as basically a mafia, and they are a hotbed for sex trafficking, and for money laundering, and kind of facilitating the kind of criminal underworld around the world. That if you want to move your assets or your commodity flows from the black market to the gray market and then above board into the Western banking system, the UAE is there for you. If you are a corrupt kind of Nigerian mine owner or something, you own a lot of property in the UAE, and your money flows through there. One of the key elements of their kind of global operation, the UAE's, is Dubai Ports World, DP World. Chairman of that is Sultan Sulayam, and we wrote a piece in mid-January about him and his relationship with Epstein, which now people are now circulating again in the wake of some of these more recent emails that have come out. Sultan was very close to Epstein. He's completely engaging in all of the predatory, perverted stuff as well. Because you have some people in the emails who are very clearly working closely with Epstein, but they're not getting into the banter, and so you don't know are they actually making just a lot of money with Epstein and around him for his power and his connections, or are they also into the sex trafficking? With Sultan, it looks like it's all of it. It's gross in the emails. Epstein had bragged years ago that he knew the owner of the I think it was the port in Djibouti so well that he basically ran it, and people were like, there goes Epstein like bluffing again. And it turns out, oh wait, no, this is all pretty accurate. And Epstein very much understood that commodity flows and money, and basically money laundering and the shipment of goods, and controlling those choke points is where power is. And he understood the wealth and power that comes from Africa in a way that very, very few people do and did. Like, he was very much focused on Africa because he understood it to be a source of diamonds, oil, raw materials, and a place that, with the right mechanisms in place, you could systematically exploit. And that's basically the Emiratis and the Israelis' project in Africa, selling cyber weapons from the Israelis, and then using that to open up entree into the country for access to minerals, oil, etc.
Wow. Well, there's quite a bit there and quite a bit to continue unraveling.
I mean, you can imagine why the media is not covering it. Like they can't get anywhere near any of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, thankfully, Dropsite News is not afraid to keep breaking all these various things down, and we really appreciate your reporting and everyone on your team. Ryan Grimm, thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
No, thank you guys.
Mm-hmm.
Man, this Epstein stuff is like this story is going to keep getting crazier. It's like, it's just nuts. And every time we learn more, what becomes clear is that the people who run the world are all a bunch of criminals.
That is for sure. And there's a lot of files. It's 3 million of them, I think, that were released. So it's kind of like WikiLeaks, which there was so many things that it actually takes a long time to even get a full feeling of it. And I remember that I think it was 3 years after WikiLeaks, they put out that book because it was so much. It was like you kind of had to put it in a form that's understandable. So I suspect we'll start to see that in the latter half of the year is good reporters like the people at Dropsite News putting it together in, not nice, obviously terrible, but packaging that helps to understand it, because it really is, you're getting an inside window into how the world is really run through the context of this guy's emails.
Right, and so a lot of some of these emails are like email chains full of like news articles. Like it's like, you know what I mean? Like, you have to wade through so much crap, and that's I think the reason they released it all the way they did, because it actually makes it harder to look through. So we will continuously be coming back to this Epstein stuff. Before we go, Eugene, I just wanted to highlight a couple important stories related to Palestine and what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank. There's still a genocide in Gaza, despite what officials around the world keep calling a ceasefire. And we know that because, Israel has killed at least 506 Palestinians and injured at least 1,405. And their nearly daily attacks that have continued to violate the ceasefire that went into effect supposedly on October 10th. We know the Israelis are still blocking materials from entering Gaza. And they dropped a bunker buster bomb, a 2,000-pound bunker buster bomb in Gaza just a few days ago. Doesn't sound very ceasefire-y to me. So the destruction of Gaza continues, but at this point, it's like there's so much other things happening in the world. It's sort of become background noise, which was always the fear we all had. And it's really scary because, people continue to be just like evaporated in Gaza. And in speaking of evaporation, apparently there was some sort of like thermo weapons. I don't quite understand that were used, that were supplies by the US that literally like evaporated people.
Yes, it's like a thermobaric bomb, and and there's actually a debate now about why the evaporation happened, which is like the dumbest debate ever. It's like, it's obviously evaporating people, but the original report from Al Jazeera was saying it's the heat of the bomb was so much that it evaporates people. But now there's military experts that are saying that it's not the heat, it's the way that it manipulates the air or something. But the basic point here is that it does create a lot of heat. It does create a lot of concussion and other things like that. But by and large, the impact is that it just evaporates human beings, which is something that it's worth noting is also associated with atomic bombs, right? So it's like using that same type of terrorism of an atomic nuclear attack without the same level of radiation, but the level of destruction. And it just shows, like, one, just how sadistic the weapons makers are, that they're trying to find ways to even create these things. But then the fact that they're being used against human beings in any context, but people who are, living in tents and have no sort of protection around them that could potentially stop this and all these other things. I mean, it really is just unbelievable to see. But that's basically the context of the whole thing, is that despite the debate about why it's happening, that there are these weapons being used that are just, if you're close enough to it, you're just evaporated.
It's so horrifying. And again, this is happening and like no one says anything. Similar, by the way, in Lebanon, the Israelis have recently been spraying some sort of chemical to basically like destroy the ability of the soil to like grow anything, so that people can't, essentially, like, the agriculture in the south is how people sustain themselves, and they don't want people to return to the southern villages that they're making it impossible to return to, because the Israelis continue to bomb Lebanon like every day, every single day. No one's even like attacking the Israelis at this point. It's
killed a young boy last week, right?
It's like, yeah, they killed a lot. Yeah, just this week they killed a child, and it's just, it's endless. And they're doing raids now into Lebanon. They actually came into Lebanon, kidnapped somebody, and took them back to imprison them. So they're doing these like raids into territory now. They've done this a few times in Syria as well. And it's just, no one says anything. It's just the norm now. This is normal now for Israel to just completely like invade its neighbors whenever the hell it feels like it, with zero consequence. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, and this is a very important aspect of what's happening, because for a long time, because Gaza's been so barbarically cruel genocide, the sort of slow motion genocide in the West Bank goes largely unnoticed. But Israel has essentially started legalizing its annexation of the West Bank. And what happened earlier this week is the Israeli government security cabinet took these legal steps that fundamentally change how the occupied West Bank is governed, moving from this kind of de facto control toward a more formal legal framework for annexation. And so basically, Israel's moved to apply its laws and authority inside parts of the West Bank that were previously governed, at least in part, by the Palestinian Authority. And I say all that with the caveat, of course, that the Palestinian Authority is basically an Israeli US-backed mechanism that doesn't really represent the Palestinian people. Nonetheless, the Israelis like basically taking over even the functions of the Palestinian Authority is just more Israeli control directly. And this, of course, then blurs the legal distinction between Israel and the occupied territories. And then there's this Jordanian era restriction that made buying land in the West Bank much more difficult for non-locals, but that's now been revoked or being revoked, which means Israeli citizens can now directly buy Palestinian-owned land with far fewer restrictions, which paves the way for more settlement expansion and essentially demographic changes in Palestinian areas, which is what this is all about. It's all about increasing the Jewish demographic majority in the West Bank while making the areas Palestinians can live on smaller and smaller until hopefully, for them, the ideal for the Israelis is hopefully one day there'll be no more areas for Palestinians to exist. And then lawmakers also approved a bill that, once passed in the Israeli Knesset, which it will likely be, would let Israel enforce its laws in Palestinian areas on matters of like building permits and heritage sites, which also would reduce the Palestinian authority even further. And so I know this sounds like a lot of like legal jargon, but it does matter, because this would mean for the first time the occupation's legal structure is being reconfigured towards annexation in law without calling it annexation. So for decades, Israel has controlled the West Bank on the ground, yes, but it was still legally an occupied territory. So this is a legal framework that would essentially change that. And that means that Palestinians' very limited self-governance would be like systematically dismantled. It's already being systematically dismantled in the areas where the Palestinian Authority actually does have control. So it's very, 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 like, the big picture of this is that, yes, Israel's already expanded settlements and its control on the ground for years and years and years. But those were, mostly de facto realities. Like, this week's shift would be this first major legal move towards annexation. And because that all sounds very boring, the way I put it, it kind of is going sort of unnoticed. with just some alarm bells ringing. And of course, all you have from like officials in the UN is saying things like, oh, this creates another obstacle to the two-state solution. And I'm like, how are you even still talking about a two-state solution? This is like the slow motion eradication, not even so slow motion, of a people. Because I'll also add that since the genocide in Gaza began, 10,000 Palestinians have been internally displaced across the West Bank. 10,000. There's been entire villages that have literally been emptied and taken apart. And that's like in addition to you might remember in the last couple of years after the genocide in Gaza started, you had tens of thousands of Palestinians displaced from places like Jenin and Tel Karam and other refugee camps and these like sort of large scale Israeli military operations that were launched last year, which was another level of displacement. And it's completely insane, Eugene. Like, you still have this talk of a two-state solution when you have 750,000 Israeli Jews who are living illegally under international law in these illegal settlements in and around Palestinian neighborhoods and cities and villages that have like become increasingly divided from one another by these settlements, and then roads they can't use. I mean, it's just a very blatant apartheid system. And it's just like, why are we still talking about two states? I know we're not, but like these international officials, like, why are you still entertaining this nonsense? It's complete idiocy. Everyone knows it's BS.
Yeah.
At this point, you have one state where Palestinians are being genocided. That's it.
Yep. Absolutely. I mean, and to take a phrase from Trump, there's a self-deportation aspect to it. It's like they want to make life so unbearable that they force people to leave the West Bank. And I think that's, a huge part of this is that it's like, it's so difficult. Well, if you don't like it here, then you can just leave. And there's nothing else that you can do about that because we're going to do whatever we want to do. And the use of these sort of terroristic type tactics, it's really quite disgusting. And I agree with you. The idea that we're, still talking about, essentially a 1967 type settlement at this point is in 2026 it's just not realistic, I think, at this point in time. And I think Israel itself knows that. And I think that's partially why they just keep pressing forward, because they know that the sort of international community is not willing to actually, so-called international community, take the steps that need to be taken. So yeah, really, really crazy, the moves that are being made here. In addition to, what's happening with the expanded settlements around East Jerusalem and all these other pieces, I mean, it really is extremely, it's ethnic cleansing. There's nothing else we can really say about that. Well, we are, going to continue to cover all these various stories and all the various facets. And of course, we appreciate everybody who joined us here. We want to shout out Kirk Dougherty, I think it is, who donated there in the chat. Yes, Kirk, shout out to you. Did I say Kirk?
You're a champion.
Anyway, shout out to you. Sorry if I got it wrong.
Kirk is a champion. Kirk is a champion.
Like Captain Kirk. Here we go into the wilds of the universe. Anyway, Rania, things that you would like to let our viewers know before we get out of here.
Yes, I want to remind everybody that we are an independent media outlet that exists because of your support, support from people like Kirk. Thank you, Kirk. If you are able to materially support us, you can always donate in the live chat. But, if you want to do something more regular, like monthly, let's say, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a member of Breakthrough News for as little as $5 a month, but there's no cap. You can give us more, where you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch. But most importantly, you can be helping to support an independent media outlet that is telling you the truth about the world and that wants to help build a better one. So patreon.com/breakthrough news. Make sure that you're subscribed to Breakthrough News on all social media platforms, including this one that you're watching us on, YouTube. And make sure that you hit the bell when you are subscribed to us on YouTube, and you hit all so that you can get notifications whenever we post new content, so that you never miss an episode of our live stream, which we're doing right now, or of my show, Dispatches with Rania Khalek, that's me, and all our other awesome shows like The Socialist Program, The China Report, and we've got really cool things coming up at Breakthrough News very, very soon, which we'll be excited to announce, so keep an eye on us here so you can find out about those announcements as well. And beyond that, make sure that you smash the like button.
Smash
it's easier than even
like button.
There you go. It's super easy to do. It doesn't require any money. You just hit it. You just hit like, thumbs up. It helps boost us in the algorithm.
Yes, I agree. And while you're at it, why don't you, after we get off the air, go back to the channel that we have there of Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Watch all of them and like those too, which will definitely help us in a big way. And you also will become very edified and much more intelligent after watching any or all of the episodes of Dispatches with Rania Khalek. For myself, for Rania, of course, it's the truth. And the whole Breakthrough News team, we are very, very honored. Thanks so much for being with us. Shout out to all our patrons, and we will see you next time.